Ethan Carter had never imagined that the peaceful rhythm of suburban life would ever descend into chaos. A decorated military veteran with an unwavering sense of duty, Ethan now served as a respected city official. In his spare time, he lovingly restored classic cars in the sanctuary of his beloved home, a modest, well-kept house in a quiet neighborhood that had become his personal retreat. Every detail mattered to Ethan: the carefully maintained garden, the vintage tools in his garage, and the warm glow of his porch lights that welcomed neighbors and friends alike. For Ethan, his home wasn't just a building. It was a testament to his hard work, his service, and his determination to create a space where honesty and tradition prevailed. Yet, lurking in the heart of this once tranquil community was a force determined to enforce its own version of perfection, a force embodied by Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. Karen wasn't merely a board member. She was the face of entitlement, an uncompromising enforcer of arbitrary rules that she insisted were sacred. With a haughty smile and a gaze that brooked no dissent, she presided over the HOA meetings like a monarch ruling over her domain. Karen's obsession with control extended far beyond aesthetics. In her eyes, every deviation from her rigid standards was an affront that demanded immediate correction, no matter how trivial. Her first encounter with Ethan had been seemingly innocuous. One crisp autumn morning, as Ethan was setting up a new workbench in his backyard, Karen appeared on the sidewalk. With a clipboard in one hand and a look of thinly veiled disdain in her eyes, she pronounced that his recently installed driveway spikes, meant to deter petty theft, violated the HOA's safety and aesthetics ordinance. In Karen's world, even a well-intentioned security measure was a transgression against the collective beauty of the neighborhood. Ethan was taken aback. "Spike strips?" he repeated, incredulously. His driveway, which he had carefully engineered for both functionality and protection, suddenly seemed to be the center of a bitter power play. Karen's tone left no room for debate. "Your property is part of our community, and you are expected to abide by its rules," she said sharply. For Ethan, who had always prided himself on fairness and due process, this sudden imposition felt not only unjust, but deeply personal. It was as if his very right to secure his home had been challenged by an entitled bureaucrat. As Ethan argued that his safety measures were legal and necessary, Karen's lips curled into a smirk that belied her true intentions. She wasn't interested in reason or discussion. She was intent on establishing her authority. The confrontation, brief as it was, set the stage for what would become an escalating battle between personal rights and authoritarian rule. Ethan's frustration mounted. Here was a woman who saw herself as the arbiter of community norms, ready to fine and intimidate anyone who dared to deviate from her exacting standards. Later that day, while Ethan was working on a vintage Ford in his garage, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling of being under siege. His driveway had always been a place of refuge, a practical barrier against intruders, and a symbol of his self-reliance. Now it had been marked as a potential hazard by the very institution that was supposed to protect and serve the residents of the neighborhood. As twilight descended and the warm glow of his porch lights illuminated his home, Ethan felt that the battle lines had been drawn. Karen's actions weren't just an administrative oversight. They were a declaration of war against homeowners who dared to value safety over compliance. This first clash was only the beginning. Ethan's mind churned with questions. How could a simple safety measure be twisted into a pretext for harassment? And why was Karen so obsessed with minutiae that endangered the very spirit of community? The answers were shrouded in the murky world of HOA politics, a realm where rules were bent, fines were handed out on a whim, and personal vendettas masqueraded as civic duty. As he turned off the workshop lights that night, Ethan resolved to stand his ground, determined not to let an entitled few dictate the terms of his life. The morning after the initial confrontation, Ethan awoke to an unsettling sight: a freshly printed, official-looking notice slapped onto his front door. The document detailed a $750 fine for violating community safety and aesthetic standards, a charge that, in Ethan's mind, was preposterous. Yet there it was, sealed with the HOA's emblem and signed by none other than Karen herself. Ethan's pulse quickened as he read the document. It wasn't just a monetary penalty. It was a public shaming, a power play designed to intimidate him into submission. He recalled Karen's smug expression the day before, her eyes cold and unyielding. Now, as he ran his finger over the embossed lettering on the fine, Ethan felt the weight of injustice pressing in on him. The rules, as applied by Karen and her entourage, were arbitrary and suffocating. Determined not to be cowed, Ethan resolved to fight back. As a city official, he was well versed in local ordinances and zoning laws. He knew that the HOA's so-called regulations were not only unreasonable, they were legally questionable. With a steady hand and an unyielding resolve, Ethan drafted a formal letter to the local zoning board. He cited specific statutes that affirmed his right to install security measures on his property and challenged the legitimacy of the fine. But Karen was far from defeated. With an air of entitlement and self-assurance, she began orchestrating her next move. That very afternoon, as Ethan's letter was being delivered, he noticed several unfamiliar vehicles parked along the street. Uniformed inspectors, armed with clipboards and official badges, began to examine not just his property, but those of his neighbors as well. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted palpably. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that Karen had coordinated a series of anonymous complaints, all designed to harass Ethan and tarnish his reputation as a law-abiding citizen. On the sidewalk outside his home, Karen stood with her arms crossed, her gaze locked onto Ethan as he emerged from his front door. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan," she stated, her voice dripping with condescension. The words rang hollow against the backdrop of inspectors questioning every homeowner about potential violations, from overhanging hedges to the exact placement of mailbox numbers. Ethan, calm but resolute, explained that the HOA's rules could not override state and municipal law. His words were met with scoffs and dismissive gestures from Karen, who seemed to regard him as nothing more than a nuisance, a man who, in her eyes, needed to learn his place. The fine, the inspectors, and the barrage of accusations were all part of a calculated strategy to break his spirit. Throughout the day, Ethan documented every interaction. He recorded the conversations with the inspectors, snapped photos of the fine taped to his door, and even noted down the names of several board members who exchanged furtive glances with Karen. It was clear that Karen was not acting alone. Behind her lay a cabal of equally entitled board members, each ready to enforce arbitrary rules with ruthless efficiency. As evening fell, the neighborhood was abuzz with tension. Some residents expressed sympathy for Ethan, recalling times when Karen's heavy-handed tactics had rubbed them the wrong way. Others, however, were too intimidated by the force of the HOA's power to speak up. Ethan's quiet determination began to resonate with those who had long suffered under Karen's tyranny. In hushed conversations by mailboxes and over fences, talk of challenging the HOA's authority grew louder. That night, as Ethan sat at his kitchen table poring over legal documents and community records, he realized that this battle was far from a simple dispute over spike strips. It was a struggle for the soul of the neighborhood, a fight between individual rights and the overreaching power of an organization that had lost sight of its original purpose. Karen's first power move had been to send a message, obey the rules, or face the consequences. But Ethan was not prepared to back down. Every fine, every warning, only reinforced his determination to expose the hypocrisy and corruption festering within the HOA's ranks. In the days following the initial showdown, Ethan began to notice an unsettling pattern unfolding in his neighborhood. Neighbors, once reserved and polite, now whispered behind closed doors about the relentless tactics of Karen and her cronies. It wasn't just Ethan who was under scrutiny. Everyone's home was subject to unexpected inspections, mysterious fines, and the constant threat of further penalties. The HOA's grip was tightening, and Karen was clearly orchestrating every move with precision. Late one afternoon, while Ethan was tending to his meticulously maintained garden, a distressed neighbor, Linda, confided in him about a series of bizarre incidents. "Karen has been issuing false violations left and right," she murmured, her voice trembling with anger. "Last week, my mailbox was condemned for being the wrong color, and I'm not even allowed to repaint it without her approval. Linda's words resonated with Ethan, confirming that his personal ordeal was part of a larger, systemic abuse of power. Determined to get to the bottom of this corruption, Ethan began his own investigation. Over several sleepless nights, he compiled a dossier of evidence. Discrepancies in HOA meeting minutes, suspicious financial records hinting that Karen had been siphoning funds for personal gain, and testimonies from board members who had grown uneasy under her rule. One anonymous source, a board member with a guilty conscience, leaked documents suggesting that Karen's decisions were not based on community welfare, but on personal vendettas and profit. The documents revealed that fines collected from homeowners were being diverted into a secret fund, one that Karen used to lavish herself with expensive luxuries while the neighborhood struggled under the weight of excessive fees. Armed with this damning evidence, Ethan set up discreet cameras around his property, capturing moments when HOA representatives, under Karen's direct orders, inspected his property without a warrant. One chilling sequence showed an inspector examining Ethan's driveway while Karen loomed in the background, a smirk playing on her lips as she checked off an illegitimate violation on her clipboard. The cameras recorded every detail, from the inspector's hesitant glances to Ethan's quiet, determined expressions as he reviewed the footage. As Ethan's investigation gained momentum, he started receiving anonymous notes warning him to mind his own business. The threats were subtle at first, a veiled reference to property damage or a warning to stop interfering with community matters. But they soon escalated into overt acts of intimidation. One morning, when Ethan stepped outside, he found his mailbox overturned and a single note taped to it, "Don't make us do this again." It was a stark reminder that Karen's power was not just administrative, it was enforced through fear. The turning point came during an emergency HOA board meeting that was called without prior notice. Ethan managed to secure an invitation, determined to confront the leadership directly. In a crowded room filled with anxious homeowners and silent board members, Karen took center stage. With practiced ease, she denounced Ethan's efforts as rebellious and dangerous, accusing him of stirring up discord in a community that should be united. But as she spoke, murmurs of agreement gave way to whispers of doubt. Several board members exchanged glances that betrayed their growing discomfort with Karen's tyrannical behavior. Ethan calmly rose to his feet. With the evidence he had painstakingly gathered, he began to outline the systematic corruption within the HOA. He presented the illegally obtained documents, the video footage, and even the testimonies of frightened neighbors. The room fell into an uneasy silence as the truth became undeniable. Karen attempted to interject, her voice trembling with indignation, but the mounting evidence left her little room for rebuttal. That meeting marked the beginning of the HOA's unraveling. Although Karen's initial plan had been to silence Ethan through bureaucratic force, her overreach only served to expose the cracks in the HOA's foundation. Homeowners started demanding transparency and accountability. The whispered conversations in the hallways turned into resolute declarations of support for Ethan. Even some of the board members, previously cowed by Karen's domineering presence, began questioning the legitimacy of her actions. For Ethan, every piece of evidence was a step toward reclaiming the neighborhood. He wasn't just fighting for his rights. He was fighting for every homeowner who had suffered under Karen's arbitrary decisions. In that tense board meeting, as the community slowly realized that they had been manipulated for too long, Ethan's investigation became a beacon of hope. The HOA was no longer an impregnable fortress of rules and fines. It was a house of cards waiting to collapse under the weight of its own corruption. As tensions reached a boiling point, Karen's tactics grew ever more extreme. One cool morning, Ethan awoke to a scene that bordered on nightmare. His driveway had been partially excavated and lined with jagged, illegal spike strips. The message was unambiguous. Karen and her enforcers were willing to risk everything to force him into submission. With a mix of shock and steeled resolve, Ethan examined the strips. Not only were they a hazard to vehicles and pedestrians, but they were a flagrant violation of local ordinances. This was no longer a bureaucratic spat. It was a personal assault on his right to protect his home. In the days that followed, The HOA unleashed a series of retaliatory actions that left the neighborhood reeling. Karen ordered the towing of several vehicles, citing vague community safety concerns, and even went so far as to shut off utilities in homes that dared defy her mandates. Fake lawsuits were filed over minor infractions, a neighbor's poorly painted fence, a misaligned sprinkler system, and every action was meticulously orchestrated to terrify the residents. The streets, once filled with the sounds of everyday life, became battlegrounds of intimidation and fear. Ethan, however, refused to be cowed. Knowing that a direct legal challenge was his best and only recourse, he gathered every shred of evidence he had compiled. With his collection of video footage, financial records, and eyewitness accounts in hand, he prepared to expose the corruption that had turned the HOA into a ruthless machine. At the next community meeting, held in a hastily arranged town hall, Ethan arrived with a thick file of legal documents and irrefutable proof of Karen's overreach. The meeting hall buzzed with anticipation as Ethan took the stage. The room was packed with anxious homeowners, board members, and even local press representatives, all curious to see if the long-standing tyranny would finally be brought to light. With a deep breath, Ethan laid out his case. He began by explaining how the illegal spike strips had not only endangered lives, but also symbolized a gross abuse of power. The legal documents he presented clearly demonstrated that the HOA had no jurisdiction over his property, especially when local laws granted him the right to secure his home. As Ethan spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted from fear to outrage. Several community members stood up in support, recounting their own experiences with the HOA's arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. One resident tearfully described how the sudden utility shutoffs had plunged her family into chaos, while another recounted how a simple complaint about a stray tree had turned into a full-blown threat of property seizure. The tide was turning, and Karen's carefully constructed facade of authority began to crumble before everyone's eyes. Karen, still clutching her clipboard, attempted to interject, insisting that the HOA was merely keeping order, and that Ethan's actions were nothing more than disruptive rebellion. But her words fell on deaf ears. As Ethan continued, detailing how each extreme measure violated both local law and basic human decency, the board members' uneasy expressions turned into open disapproval. Some even began to murmur that perhaps Karen's interpretation of the rules was less about community safety and more about personal vendetta. In a dramatic climax, Ethan revealed the final piece of evidence, a recorded conversation between Karen and a private contractor discussing the spike strips, as if they were just another tool in her arsenal. The room erupted into disbelief and anger. It was a moment of undeniable truth that left Karen scrambling for words. The community, now emboldened by the revelations, demanded accountability. The fallout was swift. Several board members resigned on the spot, and local authorities promised to launch an investigation into the HOA's practices. Karen's voice, once so commanding, was reduced to frantic explanations and hollow apologies. In that moment, Ethan not only reclaimed his rights, but also ignited a spark of resistance that promised to transform the neighborhood into a community of empowered homeowners. The strike back wasn't just about legal victory. It was a symbolic triumph over a system designed to suppress individuality and independence. Ethan's stance had shown that when truth is championed, even the most oppressive structures can be dismantled piece by piece. Realizing that her grip on power was slipping, Karen shifted tactics in a desperate bid to salvage control over the HOA. Determined to quash Ethan's mounting influence and restore her authority, she resorted to the most extreme measure yet, calling the police on him. One late afternoon, when Ethan was methodically reviewing evidence at his desk, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from a neighbor. The police were en route. In a surreal twist of fate, Karen had dialed 911, alleging that Ethan's porch lights constituted a public disturbance, and that his security measures posed a threat to neighborhood safety. Within minutes, flashing blue and red lights streaked across the street as officers arrived at Ethan's property. Confused but unafraid, Ethan greeted them calmly, displaying his city official badge as he explained that his actions were entirely legal and necessary for the safety of his home. The officers, already skeptical from earlier encounters in the neighborhood, found themselves increasingly irritated by what they saw as a baseless complaint. Karen's call, it turned out, had been nothing more than an attempt to paint Ethan as a disruptive outsider, a man who not only defied community norms, but endangered public safety with his so-called security measures. The situation quickly escalated as the officers attempted to question Ethan on the spot. However, armed with legal documents and video evidence of the ongoing abuses, Ethan calmly refuted their claims. The confrontation soon became a public spectacle. Karen's haughty demeanor crumbled as even the responding officers began to see through her subterfuge. One officer, after reviewing the footage on his tablet, muttered, "This is just absurd." The encounter ended with Karen being cautioned for filing a false report, a public embarrassment that left her authority further tarnished. But Karen wasn't finished yet. In a final act of desperation, she hired a private investigator, intent on digging up dirt on Ethan and uncovering any perceived misdeeds that could discredit his crusade. Late one night, while Ethan was asleep, security footage captured a shadowy figure sneaking around his garage. The investigator was caught red-handed as he rummaged through Ethan's personal belongings, searching for any damning evidence. Ethan, who had long anticipated such underhanded tactics, had installed extra security cameras. The incriminating footage soon surfaced on neighborhood social media groups, sparking a wave of indignation among residents. At the next HOA meeting, Ethan decided to confront Karen one last time. With the assembled community watching, he played the incriminating video for all to see. The grainy footage, though short, was enough to illustrate the lengths to which Karen was willing to go to maintain her control. Gasps filled the room as Karen's facade of competence and authority disintegrated before everyone's eyes. Her desperate attempts to cast blame on Ethan fell flat when every recorded moment contradicted her narrative. In a final dramatic flourish, Karen attempted to take the stand by declaring that her actions were justified as a means to preserve community order. But as Ethan methodically laid out the legal and ethical violations in her approach, illegal spike strips, false police reports, and the intrusion of privacy through a rogue investigator, the assembled crowd was unanimous in its revulsion. The meeting ended with Karen's vehement protestations drowned out by a chorus of disapproving voices from the very homeowners she had once intimidated. This final, desperate move marked the nadir of Karen's reign. It was not merely a failed attempt to regain control, but a definitive turning point where the community collectively declared that intimidation and abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. For Ethan, the confrontation was a cathartic moment, a public declaration that the rights of a homeowner far outweighed the arbitrary dictates of an overreaching HOA. In that charged atmosphere, as the police departed and the community rallied behind him, Ethan realized that justice was finally within reach. In the wake of Karen's disastrous final move, the community began mobilizing with an intensity that even the HOA board had never witnessed before. Fueled by outrage and bolstered by the clear evidence Ethan had presented, long-simmering resentment among the homeowners exploded into action. Within days, a series of emergency meetings were held, this time not in the cramped confines of the HOA boardroom, but in public spaces where every resident could have their say. The collective sentiment was unanimous. Karen's days as the tyrannical HOA president were over. A swift vote of no confidence was arranged, and in a dramatic, emotionally charged meeting, Karen was formally removed from her position. The decision was met with a mixture of relief and righteous indignation. Homeowners, who had once lived in fear of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections, now found their voices amplified. Even those who had previously remained silent due to intimidation now emerged, sharing their own harrowing experiences with Karen's policies. The local city council, already apprised of the escalating turmoil, launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices. Investigators uncovered a litany of abuses, illegal fines, misappropriated funds, and a pervasive culture of intimidation. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen's luxurious lifestyle, once justified by the community contributions from fine payments, was now exposed as the product of systematic corruption. News of the investigation spread rapidly, and soon the entire neighborhood was abuzz with the realization that the HOA had been a rogue operation from the start. In the midst of this upheaval, Ethan found himself at the forefront of the community's uprising. No longer was he merely a stubborn homeowner resisting arbitrary rules. He had become a symbol of civic resistance. With the support of his neighbors, Ethan helped organize a class action lawsuit against the HOA. The legal filings cited violations of local and state regulations, and the courtroom soon became the next battleground for justice. The final act in this saga came swiftly. Under mounting public pressure and facing the prospect of significant fines and criminal charges, the HOA's governing body was forced to disband. Karen, stripped of her power and publicly humiliated, was left with little recourse. Her personal finances crumbled as fines and legal fees mounted, and her once imposing influence evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Meanwhile, Ethan, having orchestrated the downfall of a deeply corrupt system, resumed his quiet life with a newfound sense of accomplishment. Every morning, as he sipped his coffee on his porch, he remembered the hard-fought victory, a victory that belonged not to him alone, but to every homeowner who had dared to reclaim their community. For the community, Karen's removal marked not just the end of an era of intimidation, but the beginning of a new chapter in which transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights became the guiding principles. It was a triumph of the many over the tyranny of one, a testament to the power of collective action when injustice is laid bare. In the aftermath of Karen's dramatic removal, legal repercussions rippled through the now exposed HOA. Local authorities, backed by the evidence Ethan and other homeowners had painstakingly gathered, imposed severe fines on the former board for illegally enforcing non-existent rules. Several board members found themselves facing personal legal consequences, and civil lawsuits were filed on behalf of the entire neighborhood. With the class action suit advancing in court, it was clear that no one within the corrupt organization would escape accountability. Ethan, acting as both a community advocate and an unofficial legal consultant, coordinated meetings with attorneys and helped his neighbors understand their rights. The state's legal intervention not only led to significant financial penalties for the HOA, but also prompted a sweeping reform in local housing regulations. As the case progressed, media outlets picked up the story, further pressuring authorities to clamp down on any similar abuses elsewhere. It wasn't long before the HOA was officially dissolved, a symbolic and practical end to an era of intimidation. For many, this legal victory was more than just a monetary settlement. It was a reaffirmation that justice, when pursued collectively, could prevail against even the most entrenched systems of corruption. The community celebrated not only the legal consequences that befell the HOA, but also the personal triumph of every homeowner who had taken a stand. In a cruel twist of fate, the woman who had once ruled the HOA with an iron fist now found herself facing a series of personal calamities. Karen's removal from office was only the beginning of her public undoing. As investigations progressed, evidence of her personal misconduct emerged. Financial irregularities, misappropriated funds, and even allegations of fraud painted a damning portrait of a leader who had long abused her position for personal gain. Unable to withstand the mounting legal pressure, Karen's once comfortable lifestyle began to crumble. Her prized residence, a stately home that had served as a symbol of her supposed success, was put on the market as creditors and former board members clamored for restitution. Rumors of a bitter divorce circulated, and soon, even former allies distanced themselves from the disgraced HOA president. In a public display of poetic justice, Karen was forced to relinquish not only her position, but also her personal assets. Her reputation reduced to a cautionary tale in local news headlines. Ethan, watching these events unfold from his quiet porch, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The poetic justice was complete. For all her years of enforcing draconian rules on others, Karen now had to live with the consequences of her own unchecked power. Every courtroom drama, every newspaper article, every whispered conversation at the local diner confirmed that her time at the top had come to an ignominious end. The neighborhood, now free of the HOA's oppressive grip, slowly returned to its former state of quiet camaraderie and genuine community spirit. Streets once shadowed by fear and intimidation were now bathed in the warm glow of renewed trust. Neighbors gathered on front porches and in local parks, sharing stories of hardship and, ultimately, of victory. For many, Ethan Carter had become a local hero, a man who had not only defended his rights, but had ignited a movement that restored dignity and fairness to the community. On an unusually clear evening, as twilight descended over the neighborhood, Ethan relaxed on his beloved porch. The air was filled with a gentle sense of relief and quiet celebration. A group of neighbors strolled by, playfully brandishing an outdated, tongue-in-cheek HOA violation notice for something as trivial as excessive garden gnomes. Laughter erupted around him, and for a moment, it seemed as though the wounds inflicted by past tyranny were finally healing. With a wry smile, Ethan took the notice and held it aloft. "They really tried," he murmured, half in jest and half in genuine triumph. In that final gentle moment, the legacy of a community united against injustice was sealed. The long, tumultuous saga of overreach, corruption, and entitled abuse had given way to a future where the voices of the many had finally prevailed over the tyranny of the few. As neighbors clapped him on the back and exchanged relieved smiles, Ethan's thoughts drifted to the long road ahead, a road that promised continued vigilance, fairness, and respect for the rights of every homeowner. The battle against injustice was far from over, but for now, the community stood together in a quiet, unspoken pact. Never again would anyone be allowed to abuse power in the name of order. Fade to black.